This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. The tension over having armed police on public school campuses isn't new, but it's moved into the spotlight amid the recent massive public protests in the wake of George Floyd's death in Minneapolis. In early June, the Minneapolis School Board voted unanimously to sever its ties with the city's police department, and other districts nationwide have been following suit. Joining us to talk about the latest developments and what education reporters should have in mind for their own coverage is Mark Keirleber. He's on the school safety beat for the 74. Mark, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the definition. What is an SRO?
A school resource officer, according to, say, the federal definition would be a police officer, a sworn law enforcement officer responsible for safety and crime prevention in schools. But they can differ a little bit across schools and across communities across the country. While some school districts, like the Los Angeles Unified School District, have their own police departments, most school resource officers are employed by local police departments and sheriff's offices. They attend the police academy, are hired by the police agency, and are stationed in schools, but they ultimately answer to the police chief or the county sheriff. I will say, however, that I generally don't really use the term school resource officer as my primary language in my reporting, simply because it's a bit of a jargony term that obscures what they really are. They're police officers who carry guns, have authority to arrest, and are simply stationed in schools.
That's a really good point, Mark. And let's talk about that for a moment. If we are talking about potentially resetting the bar or expectations for the role of school police in schools, maybe it's time to reset some of the language that we use around this. There is an SRO association, the National Association of School Resource Officers, and they like to emphasize that if you use the term SRO, it should meet their definition of what an SRO is. And part of that is that these officers have received specialized training to work with children and adolescents. It's not just a police officer who's gone to the academy and is then assigned to a school. So I think you make a really good point here, and it's something for education reporters to be thinking about, this precision of language.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly the National Association of School Resource Officers has some vested interest, especially, when talking about them being trained. They offer those, they offer training. So they want that language. But the fact of the matter is that there is no, federal standard for the training requirements of school police officers. Most states don't have laws governing the training requirements of police in schools. And frequently when there's a violent altercation between a student and a resource officer at a school, I'll call up NASRO, and they'll often say, well, that officer actually wasn't trained by us. They say they maintain a spreadsheet of people who were, and that's, they often say, if you weren't trained by us, then you're kind of not part of our responsibility.
It's also interesting to me that we don't have a precise number of how many police officers there are assigned to public schools, how many are using unarmed security guards. A lot of this data is collected, piecemeal. There's not a federal reporting requirement for this, is there?
You make a good point, but you know how America's schools are really quite fragmented, right? While there is, a federal education department, a lot of governance is local. It's local control and education, and there's possibly one sector of government that's even driven more locally than schools, and that's our police.
We've mentioned Minneapolis. What are some of the other districts that are talking right now about cutting their ties with their local police departments?
Rather quickly, these protests turned to police and schools, and following, the decision by the Minneapolis Public Schools, really the dominoes just started to fall. We're talking about several dozen communities nationwide that are either in talks to sever ties with their local police departments, or have already done so, or are, maybe considering, substantially cutting the funding for resource officers. So certainly the responses has varied nationwide, but, some other ones that are really interesting, Denver was a quick responder after Minneapolis. Interestingly, they had already been in talks for the last few years about, looking at different approaches to school safety. One that I think is really quite interesting is Oakland. They're one of the school districts that had their own school district police department, and so officials there have decided to run down their district-run police department. Another school district that I think is really interesting to watch right now is actually Chicago, and that's because a split vote there kept the police in schools. So as it stands right now, the Chicago public schools will maintain its contract with the city's police department. But it's pretty clear that that debate is far from over, and we're still not sure what will happen.
What do we know so far about what these districts are proposing to take the place or to fill this vacuum, if you will, when it comes to providing school safety?
One that's really interesting right now certainly is Minneapolis, right? They agreed to sever ties with their police department, but they don't have a clear plan yet as to what they're going to do. I think that's what you're probably going to see in a lot of school districts, and it's what is kind of at the heart of the advocacy campaign from students and racial justice groups, is to put a greater investment and emphasis on mental health supports within schools. So, I think that some of that's yet to be seen, but it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out.
I think we should point out that there are people who firmly believe that having a school police officer on campus is better for students, that these officers sometimes serve as de facto counselors, if you will, that students will give them tips about things that might be happening, that they become a resource, if you will, a school resource officer, there you go, for the students. Tell us a little bit about some of the pushback that you're hearing to this idea of cutting these ties.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, certainly in Chicago, the mayor said, that she wasn't in favor, the mayor's not in favor of removing police officers from schools. So, one interesting development that I'm seeing is that teachers' unions are starting to back the movement to remove police from schools. They've long supported the idea of having officers on campus, and it's not terribly surprising their rationale. If you look at a recent educator survey from Education Week, an overwhelming majority of teachers still support, the idea of having police officers in schools. But the unions are starting to change their tone, so that's an interesting development. But yeah, overwhelming support among educators for keeping officers in schools, and they certainly are pointing to high profile but statistically rare school shootings like what happened in Parkland as rationale for placing the officers in schools. And like you said, the whole idea behind school-based policing, the SRO model is really rooted in what we call like community-oriented policing, where you place officers in the community to try to build relationships with people. So there are examples of police serving as, the coach of the middle school softball team, or taking a student to prom. There are examples clearly of officers building strong relationships with students.
Those are really good examples of, some of the anecdotal evidence that we've heard about, but you've also been looking at some of the research on the impact of having school police on campus. Tell us a little bit about what we know about what happens when you have school police there. And I'm thinking specifically for Black and Brown students, and also, what are the gender disparities here?
Despite the growth in school policing really since the 1990s, research on their efficacy is largely failed to keep up. And information about their effects on campus safety remains limited. But what we do know is that when police are on campus, there are higher arrest rates of students. That's especially for disorderly conduct, which are, low-level offenses like causing a disruption in class. Black and brown students, and Black boys in particular, face disproportionate arrest rates in schools. Meanwhile, research suggests that students who are subjected to punitive discipline, like suspensions and arrests, they're also more likely than their peers to repeat a grade, to drop out of school, and to become involved in the juvenile justice system. One interesting report, forthcoming report that I just wrote about, suggests that police view campus threats differently based on the student demographics of a school. Officers in a predominantly white community viewed outside intruders as the biggest threats, but in a more racially diverse district, the officers were more concerned about the students themselves. And because juvenile crime rates were similar in both of the communities, the researchers theorized that that difference in treatment is the result of racial bias. So while the proliferation of police in schools has been driven primarily by school shootings like Sandy Hook and Parkland, it's important to note that there's really no evidence to suggest that officers are effective in preventing incidents. In fact, the school officer in Parkland was arrested for failing to confront the gunman. Meanwhile, the flip side of the argument, right, from groups like the American Civil Liberties Union, they say that, a report from them found that millions of students attend schools with police officers, but they lack counselors and psychologists, suggesting that maybe our priorities are off base.
We're talking with Mark Keirleber of the 74 about his coverage of school police issues. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to head on over to ewa.org to find out more about our upcoming virtual national seminar to be held July 21st through the 24th. We have scholarships available for qualified journalists. Mark, let's talk a little bit about what is responsible coverage of school police and school safety right now. What should education reporters be thinking about?
I think that first and foremost, given the uprising among student activists, I think it's a good opportunity to take a listen to what students in your community are saying about police, and to really examine the research and the rationale behind placing officers on campuses. Like I said, school police have long been driven by, mass school shootings like Columbine, but there remains limited evidence, one, that officers are effective at deterring such attacks, and frankly, such attacks, while very emotional and very consequential, are statistically rare.
And, also, I agree with you about the idea of student voice here. I think talking with young people about what the experience is like to be in a school that has an armed police officer, what their interactions have been, for worse or potentially for better. Because there may be some students out there who want to share experiences when they were glad to have an officer on campus.
That's a really good point. The ones with the loudest voice right now are the ones who are concerned about officers on campus. But, there have been surveys of students, and that's not a universal experience among students. Many children, including Black students, see value to having police in schools. They are concerned about safety just like the rest of us.
So the decision by the Minneapolis School Board took some people by surprise because it was so quick. But I think even more surprising was how many school districts seemed ready to follow that lead. Do you feel like the narrative around school police, this is a tipping point, or is this more just a surge we're seeing in response to, the country's mood right now?
That's a great question. And I think that, the country's mood right now is certainly going to play into it. We're in the midst of a pandemic, and there's a lot of conversations about how that can lead to major societal change. And certainly, backlash over the last 4 years in the White House has certainly galvanized progressive organizations. So certainly the current landscape is having an effect. Now, that said, research on school policing has been growing in recent years, and isn't all positive. You think that maybe information about schools in police, about the racial disparities, is certainly something that's gaining traction. I think that by and large, however, that's something that we'll have to wait and see.
You mentioned the White House. We know that President Trump's administration has largely been strongly in support of having school police on campus, and officials have also been in favor of arming teachers. But what about former Vice President Joe Biden, who is the presumptive Democratic nominee? Where does he come down on this?
Yeah, so that's actually something that I wrote about earlier this year. Even as the Black Lives Matter protest intensified after George Floyd's death, I saw tweets reminding people to go vote as a solution, and certainly civic participation is obviously important, but the issue certainly won't be so easily solved, especially in the White House. In fact, the presumptive Democratic candidate has a lengthy record of supporting police in schools. He helped write the 1994 crime bill, which created a federal office to distribute billions of dollars in grants to hire thousands of police officers, including in schools. And more recently, when he was the vice president, he led a task force after the Sandy Hook shooting in Connecticut, which ultimately led to a significant federal investment for additional school police officers. In fact, the executive director of the Police Executive Research Forum told me that he was hard pressed to think of a lawmaker has embraced law enforcement for as long as Joe Biden. And on the flip side of the coin, the executive director of the Advancement Project, the racial justice group, blamed Biden's work in the early 90s for really getting the ball rolling on what she called school militarization. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, Biden has come out against calls to defund the police following Floyd's death.
Well, it is kind of incredible when you see some of the stories that EWA members have been writing for years about school police departments with, automatic weapons and tanks that were leftover military surplus that was then ratioed out to these districts. I mean, certainly you can see there's a lot of pushback to that.
Absolutely. You kind of just hinted at what was taking place at the Los Angeles Unified School District, where they had surplus military equipment and ultimately gave some of that back to the government, which really gets to the heart of the debate that's happening right now about what it really means to defund the police. While some people are advocating for the elimination of police departments as we know them, and in their view, the police are beyond reform. Meanwhile, others are advocating for a significant reduction in funding for police departments, including, budgets for school police and reallocating those tax dollars for other social services. Both of those have really played out in schools, with some school districts at this point re-examining the amount they are spending on school policing. But in large part, the movements in the education space is really centered around a different slogan other than defund the police, which is counselors, not cops. Advocates are, demanding that the police be expelled from schools, but in their place, the districts should spend more money on counselors and psychologists and social workers.
So if I'm an education journalist and I want to take a solutions-oriented approach to my coverage of this, where do I look to see school systems that have gotten rid of their police and how that's played out? What do we know?
Well, that's where things can get a little bit dicey, because while there have been, concerns for years now among student groups and civil rights groups about, the role of school police on campuses, they haven't really had a whole lot of success in changing things, right? However, I should note that while, school policing has grown a lot in recent years, still, roughly half of campuses nationwide don't have school police officers. So for starters, you can look at the schools that don't have police in them right now and say, hey, what are they doing to maintain safety? Why don't they need police, right? I did look at one school district, though, however, in suburban Minneapolis for a new story about what they did after they decided to remove police from schools. And that actually predates this latest movement. 4 years ago, it's Intermediate District 287, and it's outside of Minneapolis. And they, for multiple reasons, decided to replace school resource officers with what they're calling student safety coaches. Reasons for that change included, the cost of maintaining school police, but also, violent interactions between the school police, who were predominantly white men, and the students in their schools, in particular Black students. So what I found in that district is quite interesting. So while there certainly is a large reduction in the number of student arrests and therefore interactions between police and students students' interaction with the juvenile justice system, not all educators are on board. There was a survey that found, roughly half of teachers didn't necessarily think that the new approach was any better. And one educator, really said to me that that violence is still a pervasive problem in the district, and that this new approach doesn't quite, solve an issue. So I should note that there are a few things that are different between, these coaches and the police. First of all, the coaches, they don't have arrest authority. They're not sworn law enforcement officers. They come from a background as, paraprofessionals. And perhaps most importantly, they're diverse. They look like the students in the schools. And frankly, they've had similar experiences with police in their communities being racially profiled and, having, running in gangs, et cetera. So they feel like that ability to build strong relationships is better in this situation, which is interesting because we were just talking about, the police being perceived as, relationship builders in schools. So their approach follows a similar sense, but they're also, trained in, understanding and recognizing students' mental health needs and in how to de-escalate conflicts when they arise.
This is a story I feel where there's a great opportunity to do some data mining, to find out what your district's track record is when it comes to interactions with students, for suspension, for expulsion. What kind of roadblocks should reporters be ready for?
I absolutely agree. Now, there is one roadblock, and that's interpreting what the data means. If a school has high arrest rates, is that a result of, say, crime in the school? Or is that a result of the presence of police who are therefore capable of performing arrests? And one interesting thing is that there's a data point that's really driving this push for police-free schools, and that is the disparate arrest rates among Black and Brown students. And it still, remains a question, the degree to which, those disparate rates are the result of implicit bias.
Mark, what are a couple of story ideas for education reporters, maybe ones that they can do this summer, and also some of the big issues they should be thinking about as we head into early fall and the new school year?
Start with the students. What do students in your school district think about the movement? Are they resistant to this idea, or are they considering, lobbying similar protests? Like you said, there are good opportunities for data here, data reporting. And for example, look at which schools in your district have police and which don't. And what are the racial demographics of those campuses? For example, predominantly white schools, are those the ones that don't have police? And if so, why? What's driving one campus to have police officers and not the other? Another might be a historical look at community spending on school police and how that's maybe changed over time. Are expenditures driven by concern over school shootings? And what justification do district leaders have when deciding whether or not to station an officer on campus? We're also at a really interesting moment where students have been months away from school, right? We don't exactly know when they're going to return to campus, but when they do, they'll likely be confronted by a whole slew of new campus rules, like requirements to wear masks or to abide by social distancing. I'd be curious to know, how schools seek to ensure compliance with those rules and what role police play if students don't follow those rules.
That's a really interesting question, and it brings up a whole new dilemma for districts, doesn't it? And who are going to be those enforcers, especially if you're removing somebody from that authoritarian role?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's certainly something that we haven't seen play out yet, but it'll be interesting.
Mark Keirleber is a senior writer reporter for the 74. Mark, thank you again for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week. Thank you for listening, and take good care of yourselves.